A very warm welcome to you all to this panel, Earth Logic, Grow Out of Growth. It's so good to have you all with us today. Thank you so much for sharing your time and energy with us. Thank you also to Copenhagen Fashion Summit for inviting us today. And thanks to our esteemed guests who are joining us and to those around the world who have been supporting us and acting on Earth Logic. I am Kate Fletcher, Professor at Centre for Sustainable Fashion, London College of Fashion in the UK.
And I'm Mathilda Tham, Professor in Design at Linnaeus University, Sweden, and also affiliated with Goldsmiths, University of London.
Today, we are examining the logic, or perhaps you might say the illogic, of growth. In response to calls for more growth, the pioneering systems thinker and environmentalist Donella Meadows would say that we should always ask a whole series of questions, including growth of what and why and for whom and who pays the cost and how long can it last and what's the cost to the planet and how much is enough. 2 years ago, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change declared a decade of change, that we have less than a decade to avert the disastrous, irrevocable effects on the planet of a changing climate. This is therefore also a decade of a shift to less and a decade which we must dedicate to growing out of growth.
9 months ago at London Fashion Week, we launched Earth Logic Action Research Plan for Fashion. Since we have reached over 1 million people globally through media articles, social media, and a number of live and online workshops and talks. Fashion stakeholders from industry, from governance, education, research, media, and citizens tell us that they trust and believe in the Earth Logic plan because it cuts straight to the core of the problem, overproduction and overconsumption driven by the economic growth logic, and because it doesn't pretend we can fix climate change with tweaks. They believe in the Earth Logic plan because it doesn't pretend it's simple, but instead proposes that we have to stay with the trouble and work for social justice and a healthy planet at the same time. And they believe in the Earth Logic plan because it offers a concrete plan that all organizations and individuals can work with. And they also see that it can work for all sectors, actually beyond fashion. Today, we want to address the most provocative and powerful proposal of the Earth Logic plan, which is a shift to less, a shift to a smaller fashion sector. We have invited to this panel 3 leaders of change: an ecological economist, an entrepreneur, a journalist. Together with them, we will examine pressing questions of moving to less, economic implications, worker impacts, and shifting behaviors for citizens and for the media. As we said, it is not simple, and we also know we have to do it. Whilst we're talking, we'd really like to also hear from you, so keep posting your questions.
So, what is Earth Logic? So, you can download the full report at earthlogic.info, but a short introduction to it first. So Earth Logic is a radical invitation to business, governance, the media, to education, to put Earth first, before profit, before everything. This is both simple, because if we have to do it if we're going to avert catastrophic climate change within the time frame of less than a decade. Simple, yes, but it also changes everything. Because when we put earth before profit, we don't ask, what is the business case for sustainability? We don't ask how we can make money from sustainability, but instead we define the purpose of business differently. We ask, what is the sustainability case for business? In what ways can business, or any activity, make a real contribution to a healthy and just planet? What we're talking about here is a planet-first sense of purpose that specifies the appropriate ends for business and economic activity.
Does it have to be this drastic? Do we have to change this much? Yes. Earth Logic is based on the global scientific consensus, drawing on evidence including from the Stockholm Resilience Centre, which feeds into the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change. The researchers that created the influential planetary boundaries model, along with many others, recognize that incremental change is insufficient and that we have to deal with the underlying forces if we wish to make the change that we need to make. We have to work deeper at the level of the system and the paradigm. Leading scientists call what needs to happen the great transition, as opposed to conventional development. To put this in context and to explain what change of this scale means, product level change is tweaks, such as replacing conventionally farmed cotton with organic cotton. This characterizes a first generation of approaches to sustainability. It's certainly important, but benefits are eaten up by ever increasing volumes. Systems change can mean new business models, shifting from products to services, changes in law and policy, as well as changes in relationships. This can be termed a second generation of approaches to sustainability. Again, an improvement, but as the sector expands, even benefits here are eaten up. The paradigm. This is where the purpose of the fashion sector is set. Currently, this is growth. Without change here, the sector will keep growing, and at best, it's getting worse more slowly. When Darwin proposed his theory of evolution, this was a new way of seeing a paradigm shift. We also propose a shift, Earth Logic instead of growth logic. Earth Logic places the health and survival of our planet Earth, including humans and other species, before business interests. Earth Logic consists of 3 parts. The first is a values explicit context. This is important because science tells us that values actually are more effective at changing behavior than, say, money. An example of our values is care, which can radically transform our relationship with fashion. The second part is a checklist to keep work on Earth Logic course, such as that we need to leave behind notions that technology will fix it and that somebody else will do it. The third part is the 6 landscapes to direct work.
Today we are zooming in on one of the landscapes, less, grow out of growth. As you've already heard, incremental change will not be sufficient. And some notoriously careful scientists from the University of Cambridge stipulate that all sectors will need to both reduce and shift their energy consumption to meet climate change targets. They suggest a complete phasing out of any electricity using activities that can't be electrified and therefore switched to renewable sources, and a minimum of 40% reduction in total activity. Less is the largest provocation associated with the transition to sustainability. And here lies the greatest temptation to veer into techno fixes. In conversations, we find understandable resistance to the challenge of less, and a lot of effort gets channeled into get-out clauses, into coming up with ideas for exceptions and exemptions. To address some of the crucial questions that less raises, we have brought in an ecological economist, Professor Giorgos Kallis. Welcome, Giorgos. First of all, can we ask, why will sufficient change not happen within the dominant economic model?
The dominant economic model is based around the idea and the pursuit of GDP growth. If the economy doesn't grow 2 or 3% per year, it risks collapsing. It is what we face now. It's also what we faced in 2008. The moment the economy slows down, it's like a bicycle that unless you keep moving the wheels, the bicycle falls down. But 3% per year might sound very little, but for those a little bit familiar with the logic of exponential curves in mathematics, 3% per year means that the global economy of today, by the end of this century, will be 12 times bigger. 12 times bigger is an unthinkable amount. Right now, the economy is moving $80 trillion in goods and services. This means that we expect an economy and we structure the whole society, mobilize the whole society to produce an economy that by the end of this century will produce 12 times more, or if you want, 12 times faster what it produces now. Almost 1,000 trillions of dollars going around. But the economy is also material. It's 90 billion tons of materials that are extracted and used right now by the global economy. And we expect, and we structure our life around the expectation that by the end of the century, we're gonna move 12 times more materials around. This makes any transition that does not question this goal of economic growth seriously impossible.
Thank you. So it's clear that the dominant economic model isn't working. It's insufficient if we're going to really meet these climate change targets. Yet the growth economy is so pervasive. It's like almost the water we swim in, making it hard to see it clearly. But there are other ways to organize the economy, aren't there? Can you talk a little about some of the ways that alternative economic models can avoid a reduction of quality of life and increase social justice?
In my recent book, The Case for Degrowth, I built a case for escaping this menace, I would call it, of economic growth by rooting our economies into a new economies of what we call the commons. So economies of collective production, of consumption, of sharing, of cooperative production, a different way of organizing and governing the economy. A core question there is the question of justice. And I think justice, first and foremost, is about sharing. It's about sharing and about redistributing. Right now, 2,000 billionaires own as much wealth and have as much income as 4 billion people in this planet, and it's just 2,000 people. We're talking about an extreme amount of inequality and injustice that we haven't seen the last century. And first and foremost, the question of economic transformation is a question of ending with this injustice and redistributing from those that have too much to those that have too little. It's also a matter of shifting production from producing excess and unnecessary, in many cases, goods and services, to producing the basics, to securing the basics. With the crisis we faced with COVID, this became more evident than ever, that there were too many things that could be easily cut, and we didn't have the capacity to shift resources to what was vital and necessary, which was the protection of public health and the securing that the basic needs of everyone will be met. So we produce too much, but at the same time, we haven't found the mechanisms to redistribute and move the excess of that, of the unnecessary we're producing, to securing that we produce enough and basic for everyone. An economy of the commons, we emphasize, is an economy of relations, an economy of relational goods. an economy where well-being is produced through our relations, which are infinite in a way, and they don't have the limit that the material economy has. Right now, our economy is driven by positional goods, goods that they cost a lot, that we want to acquire them in order to position ourselves in terms of status or in terms of class higher than others. These goods are infinite and limited and ultimately destructive. So we need to transition to an economy of the commons that it's built on relations, not positions.
Thanks, Giorgos. Thinking about relationships and justice, there's one question that's so frequently asked when we begin to talk about less, and this is about what does a shift towards less mean for employment, including those in the global south?
Yes, it's a strange feature of our current system that if we have to work less because we don't need to produce things that they are damaging for us or that we don't need, we have to work less, and that's considered as a problem rather than as an achievement. If someone told me, you don't have to produce this unnecessary thing you're producing and you can sit in your house and enjoy it with your friends and family, this is something good, no? But in the current society, having to work less is framed as a problem of unemployment. It doesn't have to be that way, and open-minded economists, not all economists, but open-minded economists since Keynes already in the 1930s have argued that if we become more productive and we can produce more with less, or if we want to produce and consume less and therefore work less, the easiest thing to do is to share the available amount of work. Everybody works less and everybody has work. There's going to be less work to go around and we can all work fewer hours, but everyone have work. Right now what we have is people who work too much and people who don't have work. A basic proposal of the new type of economics that I'm an advocate for is the idea of reducing working hours. Reducing working hours means sharing work, working less and sharing the work that there is. About the global south, I think it's too big of a category to talk about the global south as one thing. There are obviously countries and areas and people, I would say, we better have to think about people, low-income people, where they lack basic needs. And there is a need for more production and more consumption of these basic goods, and also more work to be done. But again, in the global north where we are based, I don't see any strong case for more work, more production, more consumption. We are produced too much and we can share what we are producing and work less.
Thanks, Giorgos.
So, Giorgos, you really showed us that there are different ways to look at employment. And as you all know, of particular importance as we make the transition to consider the implications globally. That is one of the key things when we face less. And frequently, protecting employment opportunities is used as a reason not to make the transition to less. It has even been said that it's socially irresponsible to make a shift to a smaller sector. And this is actually really cynical, since many workers are geographically located in places that feel the effects of environmental disaster first. Safia Minney is an award-winning social entrepreneur and founder of fashion company People Tree. She certainly has first-hand experience of bringing together environmental work and social justice work, and she can provide, therefore, some invaluable perspectives. So we met her and we asked her to spell out what will the reduction in the material scale of the economy actually mean for workers.
Hello, I'm Safia Minney. I'm founder of People Tree and Real Sustainability, author of Slow Fashion and also Slave to Fashion. I think the argument's often used that we can't contract the fashion industry without impacting very negatively the workers within it. But I'd argue that if we look at the FOB price and we see that only 3% on average is spent on labour, that there is a totally different way of doing fashion. And I think we've proven that in fair trade. So from using organic regenerative agriculture, we can grow organic cotton, we can pay the farmers decently whilst strengthening the fertility of the soils, creating a carbon sink, which is going to also create and mitigate the worst of climate change. At the same time, we can use craft skills like hand weaving, hand knitting and hand embellishment to promote livelihoods in rural areas, which after all is where garment factory workers would prefer to be living in many cases. So there is a different way of doing fashion. It's about producing less, but increasing the value addition in every product that we make and buy.
Safia has also told us that better models actually already exists and that they have been piloted in other sectors and that the problems and that they also have been troubleshooted, and that what we really need to know now is to implement them in fashion, and that we also need to bring investors in asking critical questions into the mix. But we feel that this leads to a critical and more structural question about how the global south can thrive if the global north shrinks its resource consumption, given the global nature of business.
The Global South will continue to be a very important supplier of regenerative organic agriculture and other sustainable fibres and fabrics. There'll also be this burgeoning and excitement around the traditional craft skills that we find in Asia, in Africa, and Latin America, and those will support some of the heritage skills that we're refinding here in Europe. And I think there'll be a transition also to more selling from one global south nation to another as we find the population increasing in the global south. We already have great examples of this in the fair trade movement. But importantly, it will be putting people and nature central to how we create and look after soils as a carbon sink and how we produce clothing that truly respects people and planet.
So to summarize, Safia is sharing that the global south will certainly be a supplier, including to other nations in the global south, but putting nature and people first.
Systems change is only possible if business, governance, the media and citizens all do their bit and work together. We now turn to critic and journalist Daniel Penny to think with us on the role of the media and consumers. Daniel, welcome. Can I ask you first how citizens, consumers that is, can accept lifestyles of less?
Sure, thanks Kate. I would say consumer habits are deeply ingrained and we're not suddenly all going to decide one day to stop buying things. In the era of zombie capitalism, most people relate to fashion exclusively through consumption, which is a fairly recent phenomenon historically. Cheap clothes, I think, better than almost any category of things you can buy, scratch the psychological itch for something new and the social desire to be seen wearing it at, as we know, grave environmental cost. So I think the way to start to live with less, to use your phrase, is more of a paradigm shift. It's no longer thinking of ourselves as consumers, so rejecting that as the label for how we relate to fashion. I think we need to identify as makers, as curators, and as, I mean, this might be a little precious, but like guardians of resources. And I would say it's the job of the media to start pushing that agenda.
And one of the recurrent critiques of environmentally conscious initiatives is that they're only available for a wealthy middle class. How can making the sorts of shift that we need avoid increasing social injustice?
From the buyer's point of view, if we're talking about environmental clothing or green clothing only being, a certain luxury price, I think the most obvious is secondhand. Secondhand is so much cheaper than buying new in many cases. It's better. And I think, I mean, I'm noticing this among younger millennials and Generation Z. There's a real shift towards an interest in vintage and secondhand, and an acknowledgement that those clothes might actually be cooler. That's what I'm trying to convince people of, because there's just so much surplus. So, you know, the idea that you have to buy a $200, I don't know, like organic cotton pair of jeans, like that doesn't really make sense to me. If you're someone who doesn't have a lot of money, you can buy a vintage pair of Wranglers on eBay for $15, and they'll look better and they'll be just as well made.
And finally, can I just ask you, well, we all know, don't we, that the fashion media is really influenced by and linked to advertising revenues, but is there any way that you can imagine that the role of fashion and lifestyle media can really support us in a transition to less?
Well, I would say yes, but there are some caveats. I think the first thing is we can't keep covering fashion as if it were consumer reporting, where we're educating readers about what to purchase next. And that really just becomes a drumbeat of buy, buy, buy. I think our role is to ask readers to be more imaginative in how they relate to their clothes, how to remix them, repair them, or upcycle them. And I don't want the fashion media to become a champion of a kind of faux minimalism, which itself becomes a trend, you know, like the KonMari method or the closet edit, where people fanatically clear out their wardrobe just to refill it in a year or two. We can't have a sustainability issue of a magazine and then go back to business as usual. And I can even give you an example. I was browsing, I won't say which, but a well-known men's fashion site this morning. And I found an article entitled 27 Early Prime Day Style Steals to Get You, ahem, primed for Amazon's big sale. So if major media outlets are publishing stories like this one about a company whose employees suffer injuries at nearly twice the industry average to meet inhuman workloads, all to deliver us cool stuff we don't need, then I don't think we're really doing our job as fashion writers. I think we can't become reliant on fashion companies for advertising, which is something that fashion media has always been over-reliant on. We need to be delivering investigative reporting, and it needs to be something that serves our readers. And in that way, like, you know, to have subscribers. The publications that are doing best at Condé Nast, I think, are the New Yorker, right? Which has, you know, not everyone can be the New Yorker, but it's something where people pay for the journalism because it's really the best, and they don't rely on advertising. And I think more other publications need to start thinking about how they, or switching to a nonprofit model and relying on grants and collaborations with the universities or whatever to fund real reporting instead of just basically like doing press releases.
Thanks, Daniel.
We've had many questions coming into us, and we will try to deal with them in different ways, maybe through social media. We want to encourage all of you to think about what you need to pack for an EarthLogic journey. We know you want to take some things, courage, resilience, and leave some things behind, like the idea that technology will fix it. We are so grateful for all of you joining us today. Thank you for spending time with us in EarthLogic. Remember, less is the biggest provocation. It's not easy, but it has to be done, and only we can do it together. We would really like to keep the conversation going with you and hear how you work with less and EarthLogic. And maybe you start by sharing exactly what you pack. So thank you again, and take care, everybody.